Great, great. Thank you very much for hosting me here, for the invitation, for your patience for 2 years to wait for my arrival. I'm going to still speak on the original concept, conference theme, optimization a little bit, and then pivot to talk about something else. I'm going to hold off on the welfare state question till the question and answer period. I have comments there, but I don't want to digress right from the start. So, and thank you for coming out in this this dawn of the, post-pandemic world to lift our heads and to convene together. I made the trip all the way from the U.S. because I think this kind of gathering, international collaboration, international intellectual exchange is critically important, not just for the discipline, but for the future of our society more generally. I think we're in a moment of tremendous change and challenge, and education has to fulfill its promise. And social scientists have a key role in that if, again, we're going to successfully navigate the challenges we're facing. And so I'm here because I think this kind of work is critically important. What I'm going to do today is, again, first speak to the conference theme of 2 years ago, which maybe I didn't need to anymore, but why not? I've been thinking about it for a couple of years. Then I'm going to move to tell you about a state-of-the-art research project that we've been doing at UC Irvine for the last 3 years. It's called the Next Generation Undergraduate Success Measurement Project. I'm going to spend about 15 minutes just telling you about the project. I think it is unprecedented in the type of data it's collecting on undergraduate students. Then I'm going to show it off a little bit by talking about giving 3 examples of how we might use that data to understand how students have fared during the pandemic, to how we could use that data to help examine questions that might be of interest to sociologists, like questions of tracking and segregation, questions of individual experience on campus, and how students in the U.S. there's a concept microaggression. They feel microaggression, they feel discrimination, and to actually empirically measure that and try to make sense of it as social scientists. So again, we'll start off with some general theoretical ruminations, then we'll turn to a concrete measurement system, and then some findings before we conclude. So first on my general thoughts about optimization in tertiary education, I'd start off with the observation that there's increasing data in all aspects of society. We all carry around the phone, and the phone tracks us, maybe more so in the US than in Europe because of the privacy and data restrictions here. But in general, more and more of what we do is mediated by data platforms, and the providers of these services use that data to optimize their interaction with us, to show us what books we might want to buy, what movies we might want to view, what seats we might want to purchase on the airplane, and the exact price point that we should buy the seat for. So optimization is used just about everywhere, and higher education has been at the forefront of encouraging that. Use that data in nonprofits to more efficiently serve clients, more efficiently serve individuals. So it's everywhere. Higher education has promoted this in terms of management, nonprofit management, business management. It's everywhere except in tertiary education. That is, we use very little data on students to intentionally design how we serve students. And so that's kind of an interesting mystery. And I make two exceptions here. In the US, and maybe internationally, data from administrative systems on course-taking patterns, there's the beginning of the use of these predictive analytical reporting systems to take that data on course-taking patterns and suggest to students, you know, given your performance in this intro course, you maybe should shift your major. Maybe you should take this course instead of that course. And so there's a little of that. And then there's a little of it in these modules, standalone curricular modules that providers might have put together, like a Pearson. Like a big publisher might have a module on introduction to chemistry, and they use that data for a little adaptive learning, circling the students back when they miss things and so on, but very little relative to all other aspects in society. And so the first thing to note is, why is there so little of this measurement? And I think that part of the reason is that it is hard to optimize social interaction when you can't agree on what the outcome is. First and foremost, what are we optimizing in education? When education itself, the outcomes of education are themselves contested, unclear. Where David said, in the U.S. We have evidence, that I've shown in my earlier work, Academically Adrift, that large numbers of students, about a third of students, very limited learning, very limited reading, writing, studying, no growth at all on generic tests, critical thinking, complex reasoning, writing. And they might say, well, who cares? I'm not here in higher education to learn. I'm here for a credential for a job, right? Or I'm here to be away from my family, to socialize, to drink beer, to build a network, maybe if I'm lucky to find a romantic partner. Okay, these are all reasonable, perfectly reasonable activities to pursue. But again, you couldn't optimize learning because there are so many other goals in higher education that compete with learning and then motivate students, enrollments, and the institution themselves. So take another, maybe it's just give them a credential. Well, if we just want to give them a credential and optimize the credential, I have an easy way to do that. No more academic requirements, demands in the courses. Everyone graduates, everyone gets an A, everyone gets a credential. Hey, I optimized it, right? So again, very difficult to optimize something where we're not sure what the demands are. The other problem with optimizing education, turns out that many of us, I don't need to tell you this in a school of education, but many people understand and recognize that education, pedagogy, is not just a technical task. It's not just a technical task where you can teach people, train people, classroom discipline, pacing, sequencing. You can do some of that, but at the end of the day, there are social and psychological dimensions of education. Education is relational at its core. And so these things are not so easily measured and optimized from a technical standpoint. And in addition, many people in higher education, the trained teachers and elsewhere, because they recognize that education is not just technical, they bring a different pedagogical commitment to their work They will actively resist increased measurement and impose it as a threat to the very nature of what they're pursuing. So very little optimization in tertiary education because we don't know what we want from it, or it's competing with a competing interest in what we want, and very little optimization because the inputs themselves don't lend themselves to measurement. But although I'm skeptical of the possibilities of optimization, I have devoted my life to improving measurement in education. And so I want to kind of pivot here and explain my pivot to hold out that social science has an obligation as a responsibility to improve measurement of education, because improved measurement can do other things, not necessarily optimize outcomes for students, but it can do other things. It could help understand the world that exists. It can identify inequalities that need to be addressed. It can help institutions more intentionally serve students. And so, as social scientists, I believe it's imperative that we focus on improving measurement of education for these broader social purposes. And we're doing just that at UCI, I believe. And so at UCI, this work was stood up initially by a generous donation from the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And in the US, as many of you know, so much of educational policy, so much of educational research is funded not by the government, but from philanthropic sources. And the Andrew Mellon Foundation funded this next generation measurement system at UCI. They stood up University of Michigan as a hub to organize the collection of data and coordination across other units that might use this measurement. And the goal of the project was the following. First, to develop and disseminate new measures of undergraduate education, because frankly, the measurement in higher education that exists is not that good to date. Everywhere else, measuring better and better. Higher education, I made the argument, not so much. This is an intervention to that problem where we dramatically improve the data collection measurement. Second, we want to use that data to improve institutional performance and advance educational equity. And so we're very closely aligned. This is not outside the university. This is my co-PI was the Dean of Undergraduate Education at UCI. They're using that data. They're now funding a lot of the data collection to improve how we serve students at UCI. And the use of the data was to promote deeper understanding of educational processes and identification of educational value. And the Mellon Foundation in particular was interested in the value of liberal arts education broadly conceived. And so I'll just leave it at that. We can, and the questions and answer, what is liberal arts education? We can spend more time if that's of interest to you. The project is bigger than that in scope, but the Mellon Foundation had long funded the humanities, liberal arts residential colleges, and all these investments were facing massive enrollment declines in the US. And so the foundation was interested in the value of these traditional liberal arts programs that they had funded for decades. So at UCI, first of all, UCI, I'm sure none of you in the room really know where it is, what it is. Irvine, UC Irvine. Irvine is halfway between Los Angeles and San Diego in Orange County. It was founded in 1965. It's one of the 8 University of California campuses. It's a top R1 university, but it's a top R1 university with a difference. 85% of the students at University of California, Irvine, 85% are non-white. 50% are first generation. Right? It is an incredibly diverse campus, top research university, but incredibly diverse student body that makes, in many ways, the perfect lab for this kind of work because it's the future of American higher education, that student body. The data is going to be archived with ICPSR. We started the project in fall 2019. 6 months before the pandemic, coincidentally. We have data on all 35,000 students, administrative data, and learning management systems data. I'll tell you about that shortly. But then a sample of students every fall we track over time with much more intensive data collection. 1,200 students every fall. Those are half freshmen. A quarter are transfer students that come in, junior transfer students. The University of California has a policy for every 2 freshmen, you take 1 transfer student from the community college system. And then the final quarter is continuing juniors all the way through. That's the design, and we track those students over time, performance assessments, surveys. I'll tell you all about that shortly. Fall 2019, right before the pandemic. Fall 2020, they start not on campus. They're remote from the start, very interesting cohort. Fall 2021, we thought that was the post-pandemic cohort. They're back, they start back in classes. Oh, sorry, go back home, remote. They also, their education was disrupted with the Omicron wave. So next fall, we'll have a cohort maybe there all the way through again. But you can see it's a very interesting set of cohorts that we happened into. It wasn't the design. We just happened to be collecting data on these students longitudinally right before COVID. And so one of the interesting questions is, well, how did they do during COVID? And how was inequality? How were patterns of inequality affected by that context? It's an interdisciplinary research team that is involved in this. I'll talk about 3 strands of data collection. The first is the administrative data. The second is the data from the learning management systems. We use Canvas. I don't know whether we use Blackboard or Noodle here. Strand 3 is the performance assessment surveys, experiential sampling. I'll tell you all about that. Interdisciplinary research team, Rachel Baker, an economist, headed up the Strand 1 team. She just moved to University of Pennsylvania. Mark Warschauer is one of the leading scholars, National Academy of Education for Education Technology. So he helped us with all the clickstream data. Jackie Eccles, my colleague, top educational psychologist, probably the international expert on student motivation. She helped us design all the surveys, performance assessments, and experiential sampling with me. It's part of a larger team. These are the UCI faculty involved, postdoctoral scholars, PhD students, project staff, call out in particular international collaborators. We have ended up with lots of international collaborators in Germany. That was, I think, partly because the German government funds educational research so well, but it's also this accident that 2 of our original postdocs, Christian Fischer and Louise von Kaiserlink, they helped build the project at UCI as postdocs, went back to Germany, and have stayed involved in the project, have continued to have access with the data, brought in their colleagues and working on their colleagues. And Julia Moeller is an expert on experiential sampling in Germany, and she's headed up that part of the project from the start. Okay. So let me go through the 3 types of data. We start with the administrative data. That we have all the college application materials, so we know very detailed questions about their information about their social background. We have information on all their course-taking patterns, and not only their course-taking patterns, but every student. And so if you're a sociologist, you might be interested in not just the characteristics of the individual, but the characteristics of the other students in the classroom, the peer environment. And so for every student in every class, we measure the peer composition. We measure to what extent are students are they taking students from similar ascriptive characteristics or similar academic ability. So you really can measure the context. We also have data from the administrative data every time they interact with campus support services, academic advising, academic tutoring, career services, not the health information, we've walled that off, but everything else, we have track of that interaction. Undergraduate research programs, and so on. So very detailed administrative data. We also have clickstream data on every student in every class. And so we can use that data to measure academic engagement of students relative to their peers. So again, for every student in every class, how many hours, how many minutes do you spend on the class material? How often do you post discussion posts? How often do you reply? What is the content? We code the words in the textual analysis of the codes to see whether or not the students are using emotionally loaded words, more analytical words. So you can do a lot with this data. In addition to the academic engagement, one of the key concepts from the educational psychologist is self-regulatory behavior. And so you're able to use that LMS data in part to see whether or not the students are manifesting self-regulatory behavior and how they interact with the course material. The course material, of course, increasingly mediated the interaction between the instructor and the student by these LMS systems. So again, we have the administrative data and this LMS data on every student at UCI. But then we followed 1,200 students in more depth. And we have performance assessments, core surveys, weekly surveys. For a subsample of them take surveys every week. I'll tell you about that. And experiential sampling. So here are the weekly surveys, just to give you a sense. These are the first 5 weeks. I'm not going to show you all 30 weeks of the academic term, but you can see we asked extensively about social interactions, their coursework, their goals, their objectives, their media use, their discrimination, microaggression, mental health, social ladder, questions about where they originated in terms of a social ladder, where they aspire to, so on and so forth. We basically have incredibly rich data on anything we could think of. And by we, I mean an interdisciplinary research team. So very detailed data. Again, the weekly surveys are not on the full 1,200 students in the sample. They're on a subset of 400 students a cohort that we track. How do you get them to take these tests weekly, you may ask? we enroll them in an independent course credit for it. So they get all these surveys online in Qualtrics in the LMS system, in Canvas, and they get 1 credit per term for filling this out. So for a full year, they get 1 course credit for completing these surveys. We think that's more than warranted given the pedagogical value of reflecting on one's education and position in the system. We also have like office hours to make it look like a full course. They don't come to the office hours, just like the other students at UCI don't come to the office hours. Okay. Performance assessments. We partnered with ETS, Education Testing Service, the big assessment firm in the US, to design some innovative assessments that could measure general competencies associated with the liberal arts, associated with economic success, and civic engagement in the 21st century. And so students take them when they start, they take them after 18 months, they take them before they graduate. I'll show you one of these I love this one. This is like collaborative problem solving. Everyone says collaboration's important. We take 4 students at random, put them into a virtual platform, and ask them to solve a problem together. They get a set of documents, information, and they solve the problem individually first. Then we say, okay, interact with your peers about this question, and then solve the problem again at the end. Unbeknownst to them, the different students have different information. And the correct answer at the end is different than the correct answer in the beginning because of the full complete information. And what collaborative problem solving involves, we're able to monitor not just do they get the correct answer at the end, but what is their role in the collaboration? Do they ask questions? Do they encourage? Are they passive? Are they supportive? So we're actually able to measure the collaborative solving process, not just an outcome there. We also measure perspective taking. We give people a complex social scenario and ask them to take the perspective of someone different than themselves in that scenario. We have questions about confirmation bias, critically important in the 21st century. It turns out, once we have a strongly held view, very hard for us to take in new information and change that view. There's an assessment we do for that. We ask them to come to a judgment, we give them new information, and we see whether or not their opinions can change. There's also an assessment on critical thinking. That's an off-the-shelf one we use from ETS. And then from Sam Weinberg at Stanford, we're using his assessment of online civic reasoning, where you give people something they might encounter on social media, and you ask them to make sense of it. So here's some images. Is it reliable? Is it valid? Just the kind of task that's critical for democracy. Okay. Let me say one other thing. And the other thing we do, and then I'll go on, is experiential sampling. If you don't know about it, you get buzzed at random times, 50 random times on your phone. We ask them, very quick log, what are you doing? Who are you with? What's your psychological, engagement? And so you have a map of kind of what students are actually experiencing, what they're actually doing, where they are, what they're doing, the nature of that integrated into this system. Right? Okay. Cool, huh? So I say we had better data than anywhere else, unprecedented data. Well, I'm an American, so I do often overspeak and but a little over. But okay, that's cultural. But this data is really unprecedented in its scale and scope. We were asked by the U.S. Postsecondary Value Commission to identify a framework for thinking about undergraduate growth in a more holistic way that aligned with our project. And so you could find this online and from a longer report, but basically we believe that post-secondary growth and value, it's not just cognitive ability and intellectual dispositions, like we already know in academically adrift don't move a lot, for a lot of students don't move at all. But it's also about college, it's about finding identity, coming up with life course agency, developing self-regulatory skills. We think there was a lot of that during the pandemic. Social capital formation, social networks, and we think probably that was impacted negatively during the pandemic. Civic engagement, psychological flourishing, and mental health. So we measure all these kind of concepts, and we think that over time they track with life course outcomes like those identified. And for the first time this year, if you remember, we were tracking students from fall 2019. Half of them were juniors. They're now, if they graduated on time, they've graduated, and we'll survey them in the spring, those that have graduated, so we can start to do that kind of work. Okay. Okay, now let's get to the fun part of using some of this data to address questions that sociologists might care about. So we have first question, maybe the most important to a lot of people, top of mind, is how during the pandemic were people affected, undergraduate students affected by the pandemic? We moved to remote instruction very early. UCI has been very aggressive in its response. They closed down again to move to remote instruction again for 3 months this year. So heavily impacted, and as I said before, we have large numbers of students, first generation, from low-income families. And so going in, I would worry, my hypotheses would be declining achievement, right? The pandemic is disrupting student achievement, and growing inequality, because the more privileged students have a greater ability to be resilient in the face of these challenges. And this just gives you a sense of the dates. That fall 2019, in person. The end. We have 3 terms: fall, winter, spring. Winter. The last month of the winter term is March. That's when the pandemic. That's when the campus pushed everyone off campus and moved to remote instruction during the finals week there. There's also other stuff that's happening, the growing Black Lives Matter movement. I'm going to show you some stuff on discrimination and microaggression. That's an important social context. There's other stuff I could put here, U.S. insurrection, January, we're in California. California almost burns to the ground. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but the massive forest fires, the climate crisis, the current situation in Ukraine. These are lives unfold in social context, and so this isn't a study of students in the abstract. It's the study of students in a particular place in a particular historic moment. Starting the pandemic, we asked students, this is from spring 2020, are you concerned that the shift to remote classes will cause interruptions to academic progress? And the vast majority said yes, we're worried. And I'll tell you what, the instructors were worried, the administration was worried, everyone was very worried about that. We asked the students, what were new responsibilities you took on when you went home? And again, these aren't all privileged students at UCI. They went home and they didn't all have rooms, their own private room where their parents brought them food to, you know, and encourage them to continue on. They often had to take care of siblings, take care of parents, take care of grandparents, take on additional responsibilities. This is a word cloud of the additional responsibilities. We asked them, how often do you have access to a quiet study place, computer, stable internet, course material? You see, there's a lot of variation in that starting off in the pandemic, a lot of students didn't have kind of ideal resources to support their achievement. So lots of reasons to be concerned. However, what we found was that over time, students were able to adapt to these constraints, and they didn't affect them in the long term. So initially, if you had a study place, you were more likely to complete credits in spring 2020, but by fall 2020, these factors were no longer correlated, their initial responses with their course credits or their grades. They figured out ways to adjust to their circumstances, and the campus figured out ways to adjust to the setting. And I'll speak to two of them in particular. I'll show you evidence of one, but the campus encouraged people to move increasingly not just to recording the lectures synchronously and having students observe them, but to increasingly move to asynchronous interaction with the students to allow flexibility for the students, and also to move away from lecturing to more interactive formats with the student, more active learning. The campus had been promoting active learning on campus before, but as I'll show you in a couple slides, during that first summer, they invested heavily in faculty workshops, faculty training, to encourage people to seize the moment and move from more traditional forms of lecturing into these active learning pedagogies. So over time, the background's less critical. Stress, we asked stress over time. Turns out stress increases a little bit in the beginning, and then it reduces to kind of pre-pandemic level. So on average, students were not particularly stressed going forward by the pandemic. They adjusted there. In terms of the coursework term credits, the number of credits students received per term went up actually a little bit early on in the pandemic, has declined to existing pre-pandemic levels for both URM and non-URM. The URM students, there's a little dip in the most recent cohorts in the number of credit hours, but it's too early for me to kind of jump to conclusions about that, whether it's a temporary difference. In general, we haven't found great disparities between URM and non-URM students' academic progress. URM in the US, it's stand-in for underrepresented minority students. So at UCI, these are Hispanic and African American students primarily, about 30% of students at UCI. The GPAs actually go significantly up in the beginning. The campus also told the faculty, be understanding, be flexible. I think the faculty were a little more generous than typical with the grading. But even after that initial jump, the grades have stayed higher than before. This is attrition. 3 cohorts. Fall 2018 is before the pandemic, fall 2019, fall 2020. You see slightly more attrition from URM than non-URM across the board. If you do an odds ratio, it looks relatively flat. No clear pattern on that the pandemic is exacerbating attrition problems for URM students. URM students are still more likely than non-URM students to drop out, but the rate of dropping out hasn't changed, nor the inequality over time. It's a quick reading of this slide. I told you about active learning. Here is we asked percent of class time used for different activities, fall 2019 and fall 2020. So again, because we were collecting data in fall 2019, we have data then, fall 2020. So pre-pandemic, pandemic. We asked percentage of class time in lecturing. It goes from 79 to 57%. Huge drop in what students are experiencing in class post-pandemic. And so you would think that during the pandemic, you would think that during the pandemic, students it would be less interactive. They're all on Zoom. But in fact, from the students' perspective, they might be experiencing more activity, more interaction, because there was a lot more discussion, class activities, discussion boards than before. And so, again, from the student perspective, from the instructor's perspective, lecturing is active. From the student's perspective, lecturing is often very passive. And so they moved to how we were, what the instructional module that was delivered was changed over time also. And then we also are able to measure self-reported study time. This is the number of hours per week in their most difficult class and their most important class averaged together. And you see fall 2019, it's 6.5 hours. Fall 2020, it's 8.84 hours. So they're doing more. Again, you know, our perception is they're less engaged. You know, they're not, because we're not sitting in front of them lecturing, we're worried about their learning. But in fact, a lot of them have adapted to the constraints they're facing. The pedagogy's changed, and they're actually engaged more. They're interacting more. It's a story of adaptation and resilience, and that again, I would not have hypothesized going in. I'm going to show off the LMS data a little bit. So this is number of actions, URM students, non-URM students, different terms, just an average. And you see, we go to remote instruction, it shoots up, it continues to grow as faculty become more familiar with this. And then I was going to just pull out a particular element, how many discussion board posts students make. And you see students are increasingly doing more discussion board activity and responses to the discussion board over time. So again, this is what, you know, this is kind of what measurement can do. We can actually see what students are, how they're experiencing and interacting and enacting their education. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple other things and we'll open it for questions and answers. So I told you I'd tell you a little bit about, I'd show you one slide. I'll show you one slide here on curricular tracking, peer composition, just to give you a sense of what that data can do. So here we have a graph for non-URM students and URM students, the percentage of their peers in their class that are URM. Right, let me say that again. We got Non-URM students, URM students, what's the percentage of peers in the class that are from URM backgrounds? If the students were all taking the same classes, the curves would be identical. They are not. They sort into different majors, different classes, and so what you see is tracking, segregation, different exposures. A tale of two campuses, if you will, where students are exposed to very different peer environments based on the courses they've chosen. And again, I think we can use this kind of data to do that kind of analysis, just like what we've done, sociologists of education have done in high schools with vocational tracks and the like. We know the importance of peers, but we've ignored the extent to which higher institutional structures structure very different social contexts for students when they get to higher education. The final thing I want to show you is about discrimination and microaggression. And that is, this is from conceptually, this has been of long-term interest to me as a sociologist. Going back to the work of Durkheim, remember Durkheim wrote a whole book on school discipline when he was in the Ministry of Education in France. Discipline is at the very core of the interaction between the student and the educational institution. It's the place where the student learns the rules, norms, values of the larger society and internalizes them or not, based on their perception of the legitimacy of those interactions. And so it's been a long-standing interest of mine, the extent to which students experience US education as involving rights violations. They feel that they've been discriminated against. More recently, Daryl Wing Su coined this term microaggression, that students in education experience microaggressions. And so we're very interested in understanding this. Many US higher education institutions, including UCI, are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have whole offices of this. We have workshops on this. We have programs in diversity, equity, and inclusion. I can't tell you if there's anything central to UC Irvine, it's that, diversity, equity, inclusion. But very little measurement of what are students, who's being discriminated against and microaggression, and from whom? And then what's the prevalence? And what are the consequences? Like, the social science can intervene in this issue and unpack it, help to understand it in a way to inform institutional actions. And so I'm going to show you, we ask these students twice every term, have they experienced discrimination? Have they experienced microaggression? Discrimination is unfair, bias, or prejudicial treatment based on your race, ethnicity, gender, social class, appearance, or other characteristics. Have you experienced negative discrimination in the last 7 days? We ask about positive discrimination too, but I won't show you that. Then we also ask microaggression. We take here the exact language from that original article. The Wing Su article, we say, discriminating behavior is not always explicit and directly visible. It can be subtle, indirect, unintentional, and statements or behaviors that communicate hostile, offensive, and negative views about a person's race, gender, citizen status, religion, sexuality, or other character. Have you experienced subtle, indirect, or unintentional statement or behavior that you perceive to be offensive or hostile in the last 7 days? So again, we take it right from this new literature. There's something called microaggression. That's what it is. Okay? So first, it's prevalence. When students are in session, let me say that again. When students are in session, in campus, on campus, 15% of students report one of these things the prior week. 15%. When they're off campus, drops to next to nothing. They don't get, we miss, there's so much we miss when we're not in person. We miss the magic of being together. But we also miss, we also don't have to deal with the negative stuff from each other. And so to understand the pandemic from different people's perspective, I think it's important to hold both those truths at the same time. That for a lot of people, they like not having to come into the office. They like not having to interact with in settings that they found challenging. 9% of students reported this happened more than once a day. Who does it? Who did it? Where did it come from? Less than 1% came from faculty, teaching assistants, and administrators. For the, I'll give you an example. For the first 270, the first survey, week 3, 270 students, we asked only one named that it came from that source. So it's very, very rare that students are experiencing this from faculty, teaching assistants, and administrators if you ask them where it's coming from. They tell you the majority of it's coming from the students, other students, their peers. And this might not be true everywhere, but it's true at UCI, which is a very diverse campus, and a campus where faculty have been workshopped and workshopped and workshopped on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in the absence of all those workshops, maybe there'd be more faculty, teaching assistants, discrimination and microaggression. But all I can tell you is in the last 3 years, that's not really the source of this. It's peers, and it's other individuals, for example, strangers. I'll give you just one slide, gives you some, we asked the students to tell us what it was. Read these quickly to you just so you get a sense of it. Guy in my history class rolled his eyes when I talked because I was a girl. Another student. People are afraid of the coronavirus epidemic and often look towards my direction and avoid me because I am of Asian ethnicity. 50% of the campus is Asian. Someone made a joke about me bombing planes because I am Muslim. Next to the schools in Michigan, UC Irvine has the highest Muslim percentage student body in the country. 4, when people talk down on white people and they don't realize that I'm half white, and it makes me feel uncomfortable. Because I'm an older student, I'm always asked if I'm a UCI student. When I was buying a drink at Starbucks, the staff there was really impatient and upset because of my accent. And lastly, it wasn't directed at me, but one of my friends made a joke that could be considered off-color about being gay. He didn't mean it in a negative way, but still, smiley face. There's a whole sort of discourse analysis I know you can do about the smiley face kind of signaling, that's all. I'll leave that to the educational psychologist to unpack. One of the things you observe here, right, is who is experiencing it. I'll get to the quantitative analysis soon. Everyone at UCI. Think about it. As I told you, 85% of the students are non-white. Certainly possible discrimination, microaggression. 2/3 of campus are female. So of the 15% that are white, maybe 5% are white male. But of those 5% that are white male, there are Muslims, there's Jews, there's gays, Everyone at UCI feels that they're subject to this. And so that also, I think, is a different way of thinking about discrimination and microaggression when you look at the data than how I would have thought about it initially going in. And in fact, when you looked at the data, so this is just stuff that happens at UCI before the pandemic, this is when they're pushing out to remote instruction, to after, it drops to next to nothing. There's external discrimination still. And then I'm going to take advantage of our data. If you look at week 3, we have measures of social belonging weeks 2 and week 6. So if you're microaggressed or discriminated against week 3, does your social belonging change from week 2 to week 6? Some of the interesting things we could do. We could also look at the LMS data. Does their academic engagement drop? Does their likelihood of dropping out increase if you get more of these over time? So we've just begun to kind of explore this data. But if you do 2 sets of regression analyses, the first is on the prevalence of discrimination microaggression, you see that basically, other than social belonging, if you feel like social belonging, it's a battery of questions you ask about. If you have a problem with not having the homework, are you comfortable asking a friend to help to get the homework? Are you comfortable with asking the faculty? If you have a personal problem, are you comfortable asking your friend? Are you comfortable going to the faculty? These types of questions. There are about 15 of them. If you have a greater sense of belonging on campus, you're less likely to say this happens to you. But all the ascriptive characteristics, none of them are significant. Low income, international students, race, ethnicity, STEM major, first gen, gender. It happens everywhere. It's more of a random nature. It doesn't track with the ascriptive characteristics like I thought it would going into the study. But even though it kind of happens all over the place, what you'll see is if you had discrimination and microaggression happen to you week 3, it drops your sense of belonging on campus, controlling for the prior weeks, prior social belonging. So the thing matters. It matters to people that they're experiencing discrimination and microaggression. The universities should be figuring out ways to address this, but where it's coming from and who it's directed to, I think needs more sophisticated unpacking and nuance than always is the case. Last slide, then we'll do questions and answer. Maybe I'll answer the welfare state question. Just some basic takeaways at the end. First and foremost, we've demonstrated the ability to bring together unprecedented data, integrate it from the administrative systems, the LMS systems, student surveys, performance assessments, to create a very powerful measurement system to understand students' experience, right? And so I think that alone is worth you knowing about. Because it's worth you knowing about because wouldn't it be great if you guys did something like this here and we could have some comparative data? Second, measurement, forget optimization. I'm skeptical of that. But measurement can improve institutional performance and advance educational equity and contribute to public understandings of higher education. And it can contribute to sociology and our understanding of the lived experiences, the trajectories, the outcomes associated with educational attainment. And then finally, just a takeaway, overall, I think the data shows that because of the student and institutional adaptation, we see a surprising and remarkable pattern of resilience in the face of COVID-19. And so I should say, I want to put scope conditions about what I said. At UCI, with the type of highly selective students we serve, so it's a well-resourced institution, highly selective student body, pattern of incredible resilience. There are places that are less resourced and students that are less motivated where you might see very different patterns. But again, this is the pattern you see at UCI. And so that's it. There's my email. And let's go to Q&A. So shall I start with the welfare question? That's been nagging me the whole time. So
Richard,
oh,
thank you.
sorry.
No, it's okay. Thank you very much for this interesting keynote presentation. Thank you.
Yeah.
And now we have some time for questions or comments to discuss with Richard. So just raise your hand and ask or comment. Then I'll give you the micro.
Can I say one thing about the welfare?
Yeah, of course.
Just Sving Anderson, I can't let that go unremarked. You correctly point out to kind of the government policy that got enacted by Trump and by Biden in the face of the pandemic, which is a lot of social programs. You alluded to taxing, but I'll have to push back on that. In the U.S., it was all these new programs were funded by printing money. Yeah. No new taxes. It was the Federal Reserve kind of created quantitative, quantitative easing. They had a whole policy of pushing out more and more funny money into the system, and didn't tax. In fact, Trump reduced taxes, and then many systems were giving rebates back on top of it. So no new taxes. I think it's very hard to predict what the future holds. I think it's very likely that the Republicans move back in and control the government during first the midterm, and then the next, definitely they'll control Congress after the midterm. And so I would not imagine any long-term increase in taxation or expansion of social welfare policies in the long term. I'm highly skeptical of that, and even the ones that Biden had hoped to put in place, he never realized even that initial ambition. So that's the bad news. The good news is in the U.S., welfare policy happens not often directly through the government, but indirectly through the invisible mechanisms of the market. And so higher education is all funded by loans, and the fact that they're government subsidized is a way for the government to allow the market to indirectly subsidize the social policy and not directly do that. And you see that again and again. The approach to a welfare policy in the U.S. is indirect, and it's a hidden welfare system in the U.S. That's difficult to kind of difficult to observe at first view. But let's talk about let's do more about the paper itself, the presentation itself.
Thanks for a great presentation. So I think it's interesting to see the resilience of the students, right? And I wonder, do you have any evidence from other campuses around the US? And I wonder, maybe David knows something about Denmark and higher education. How did it all go? And I think, so there's also some issues, right? Like if you go home, there's not so many other things you can do, right? Perhaps run errands in some families, but other than that, it's, so it's also about, what time is available. And so that other things shift too, right? It's the entire equilibrium that changes in a sense under such a big change. And then I think an interesting perspective from at least a Danish perspective would be the government for years, which subsidize all education in Denmark to a very great extent, is very interested in how we can measure teaching quality, or quality of education largely, focusing on teaching quality. And they haven't really found out yet, I think, for many of the reasons you come up with. But in Denmark, the way universities are funded is through a kind of a student production unit. It's changing now, but the idea you could basically get money per credit you get through the system, each department. And now they're trying to put in new ways of measuring graduate unemployment rates, focusing on that aspects, talking about what comes out of education, but also teaching quality. And I'm interested in your perspective on that second note too.
Yeah, okay, so I heard 3 questions there. The first was, how do we know anything about whether or not these patterns of resilience exist elsewhere in the US system? I do think we know a little bit about that. At the top, this is true. The most selective, selective students, resourced institutions. So in California, that's the University of California campus system. These patterns largely hold up there. California, we then have the California state system and the community college system. And the further you go down, the more we see patterns of students dropping out. And the campuses have less resources to adjust, and the students have more challenges to continue to be resilient. So I think, again, this pattern is true for the most privileged students at the most resourced institution, and in American higher education, those two are closely linked because of the stratified nature of US higher education. So that was the first question. The second question was more of a comment that I would 100% agree with. You're right to emphasize it for the audience. When the students went home from to remote instruction, early on in the pandemic in particular, they had fewer distractions in terms of socializing and work than otherwise was the case. And so if you think about if a student is making a choice in part about, do I invest in academic activities or other things, the relative cost of investing in the classes decreased because there was nothing else to do other than watch Netflix. How many episodes of Borgen can you stream before you're ready to ready to do your coursework? Then the third, the third question was, remind me.
Teaching quality.
Teaching quality. Okay. So in the States, we have the same pressure, the accountability pressures from the government that we want to measure the quality of what you're doing. Where's the data? Well, we have employment data. You won't give us any other data, so we're going to use the employment data to measure whether or not the students are graduating with marketable degrees that kind of pay off, provide a return of investment to their education. The exact dynamic is happening in the US. I said we contributed a report to the US Postsecondary Value Commission. The majority of it's not a government, like the US, it's funded by the Gates Foundation. This past 3 secretaries of education, but it's not government. The main report talked about using employment data to measure quality in higher education. And then it also said, we know this isn't everything in higher education. Look at the sub-report by Arum, Eccles, and colleagues. We get the sub-report. So I think the point is that the government is going to use, they're going to use the data that exist for accountability purposes. And if that's just employment data, that's what they will use. And as educators, we should be, and as social scientists, we should be saying, that's inappropriate because there are these larger holistic goals of higher education, human development, social relationships, so on. But it's not enough just to critique it. We need to kind of create better measurement that empirically demonstrates the flaw of that approach. So that's That's the way I think. That's the way I think about this problem. You could, the counter argument would be, well, they're going to use this measurement to enforce accountability. No, they're not. I mean, there's not data like this. You're not going to be able to generate data like this at every university in the country for an accountability regime. So I think that fear is misplaced. But I do think we can do better measurement, and by doing better measurement, implicitly critique the use of inappropriate measures to examine the value and the returns of education.
Great data. Congrats on that, and great talk. So you have some very interesting results saying that the students are becoming more active, discussing more. But will that necessarily lead to better performance in the GPA? First question. And I could imagine that a physics student or a student in chemistry and biology would suffer for not being on campus doing lab work. So, well, you can maybe have little lab work at home, but maybe not in the same scale. So I'm wondering if there are also differences across subjects or field of study when you're talking about these results.
Yeah, so these are great, perfectly reasonable conjectures, hypotheses. We have the data to address them. We can look at the performance in the LMS data, their class discussion posts and the like, their self-reports on the survey of activity, and then look in the subsequent courses they take in the same field to come up with what was the effect of that earlier educational experience, right? You look at the same sequence of courses, the advanced coursework, to get a measure of the quality of the earlier one. We can do that. We haven't done that yet. The other thing we can do in our study that is to juxtapose those experiential measures of education with the gains on the generic performance assessments. So remember I showed off the collaborative problem solving one? One would expect that in classes with more active learning, with more class discussion board posts and replies, it's exactly that kind of stimuli that would lead to growth in collaborative problem solving. And we could assess that over time, right, whether or not it was that, whether collaborative problem solving competencies increased overall for all students, and whether it increased in particular for students that had more of this active collaborative learning occurring. So again, the two ways to do it would be with the generic assessments we have and with the looking at subsequent course performance. We really haven't done any of that yet. And I should confess that during the pandemic, it was a struggle to do this stuff. And so I feel like our team was incredibly successful in continuing to collect data all the way through, moving everything. We used to do the performance assessments in person, moved them all virtual, and generated some initial findings. But in normal times, we'd be way ahead of where we are in the analysis. And even though there's a big research team, it's next week when we've declared we're going to all be in person in the lab again. And we've made that proclamation before, and it hasn't worked out. We haven't been rubbing elbows together in the same room for 2.5 years. So we're behind where we should be in terms of the analysis, but we kind of prioritize ongoing data collection because we think this data is probably going to have some historic value too, because of this unusual context that they experienced. And I should say also, because we're doing these weekly surveys, we are able to drop in, you know, at a moment's notice, questions about the social context. So, did you participate in the street protests around Black Lives Matter? What did you think about it? What, you know, so we ask, and the COVID, you know, how often a day are you washing your hands? Putting on a mask, like we had, you know, it doesn't even make sense, some of these questions. 2 years ago, but remember in the beginning, you had to wash your hands a lot because you got it off surfaces. So we asked kind of very behavioral focused questions like that. How often do you wash your hands? How often do you go out in public? How do you wear a mask? So we've got these kind of, these very historic context sensitive questions that will likely be of value in ways, you know, in the future in ways that, you know, sociologists or historians might find of interest.
Okay, thank you very much for a nice presentation. It was very interesting. It was very interesting. It doesn't work here.
It does. It does.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I think they need it for the film. Yeah.
Okay. I'm curious about your discussion on discrimination and microaggression.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, because from a student point of view, the diversity discussion here in Denmark, at least at this university, is fairly new, and we struggle a bit about addressing it. And I wonder, are you going to discuss your findings, the actual answers the student gave with the students, and what do you think they will say? Because you have a lot of these points made by people, and what would the next step be about that?
Well, so I think my role as a social scientist is to ask these questions and present the findings in an honest way, candid way as I can, as we can. And I don't think it's for me to design the campus response to it. It's to inform what the campus is doing. So I think the implications of this for the campus, I would leave it to a conversation. You know, I would recommend that the head of diversity, equity, inclusion at UCI, he's a dear friend of mine, a historian there, take this information, can sit down with faculty and students that are part of his climate committee to make sense of it and to see whether or not there's any implications. You know, maybe there should be more activities focused on other students than currently exists. I mean, that would be one possible thing you might do, right? If it's true that the vast majority comes from other students, we should spend more time sensitizing other students to this issue and not imagine, you know, faculty, we all have a problem as teachers in being faculty-centered. If I'm lecturing, the students must be learning because I'm brilliant, right? This is this is the way all faculty have been trained, right? And not to think about the student's perspective. So again, I think some of the diversity, equity, inclusion has the same, it's the same bias of faculty centrality to the institution. Maybe the faculty are not as important to the campus as we think we are. And if that's true, then how you think about the diversity, equity, inclusion work might be different. Now, not that we don't all, we don't all need work in kind of reflecting and changing to the environment and the context and being sensitive. I don't want to let us off the hook in terms of kind of adjusting to the new types of students we're serving, changing our practices, interrogating our implicit bias. We should do all of that. But if the microaggression is not really coming from us in the first place, we shouldn't do that imagining that that's going to change the student experience.
Richard, thank you so much. What was, maybe I had a lack of awareness, but what was your question about the subject sensitivity from up here, or the field of study sensitivity? The question Martin asked,
yes.
He asked about are there any differences between subjects of fields of studies among the students when they...
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that question.
No, it's okay, but maybe it was me.
Yeah, okay. So I think the question I missed before was, are there differences across field of study in terms of the broad set of findings, outcomes here? I think there very much are differences across the fields of study. We have, not in terms of the microaggression discrimination patterns. Those seem not to be tracking STEM, non-STEM. But in terms of the types of pedagogy, the type of active learning, the amount of lecturing, the amount of hours studying, the amount of students' social belonging, all these things, the peer composition, I showed you the peer composition, all these things differ based on what track you're in, what discipline you're in, what major you're in. And so we are keenly interested in those differences, and we're just now identifying systematic measures to share with campus on those differences. So the campus just supported us hiring a postdoc that's doing nothing but generate institutional reports on these very differences by major to distribute back to the campuses to inform their understanding of how their programs differ from other programs. So I very much think these differences exist. We've showed just little hints of it here, but we're planning to do much further work on that area. Sorry for missing that earlier.
That's okay. Richard, do you have any special measurements for the mental health and resilience research? Yeah. So we've got, because the interdisciplinary team is made up of quite a few psychologists, educational psychologists, including Jackie Eccles, Jutta Heckhausen, Ted Smith, and then 3 of the postdocs also come from the field of psychology. We have a lot of the standard measures of mental health, well-being, and flourishing. Those include items from the Kessler 10. The slide I went through really quickly, pulled out 4 of those items to track over time. But we have the Kessler 10 measures. We have measures, there's another scale about academic, there's another scale about stress that students experience in different fields, academic, social, and so on. We've tracked those over time. I can't remember the exact name of that instrument. But we have, these standard measures of mental health, well-being, flourishing. And I keep saying mental health, well-being, and flourishing because we're also influenced by the more positive psychology field that doesn't just think about psychological state as being negative mental health, but to what extent does college experience lead to flourishing, a sense of well-being? So we very much built in those as well. They're not the Kessler ones. I can't remember what the scale. We use that scale to measure
that informed by there was a MacArthur Research Network, I remember, on it that we drew from that work.
Sounds good. That's not only the negative side, the stress side. Yeah, okay. Any more questions? Yes?
Yes, thank you for the fantastic presentation. I have like one question and then a correction. So you were wrong about how many people who has actually been to UC Irvine. So we are at least two more than you in this room. Yeah. And the question is about how long are you planning on doing these surveys? And maybe a supporting question for that question is, what is your takeaway? I mean, you have these numbers about more active engagement for the students, more active studying hours. What have you learned anything? What would the numbers be if things are back to normal? But next year, what would the numbers be like? Would it be back to lecturing or? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. So good. First, the question is, do we? What are our plans to continue? So I have tentative good news to report. The campus this year, we convinced that this should be an ongoing activity that's just a regular part of how the campus does its work. So that the campus should fund ongoing data collection every year, tracking a cohort, and doing these kinds of measurements. So we currently have 3 campus-supported folks doing this work, and a little money to provide incentives for the students to take the surveys, and more of the performance assessments, because they don't like to take tests. So I could say indefinitely we're continuing, but the catch is, if you're familiar with campus policies, they said, okay, this sounds good, we should do this forever. We'll give you one-time funds this year for that, with the understanding that you get them one-time funds next year, like so. They haven't become, in UC jargon, permanent funds, so the campus could pull its support out still at this point. So our plans are to continue with the data collection. I was an administrator at UCI Dean. I stepped down in part so I could do more fundraising around this project. In the US, a lot of the Mellon Foundation grant is trailing off in another 18 months, and so we need to bring in more grant funding to support this also. The final part of your question was, what do I think the pattern will be? I don't know. I'm a sociologist. I really don't know. I can give you a hypothesis. My hypothesis would be that the lived experience of students and faculty changes people's understandings and preferences and behaviors going forward. The lived experiences have changed us. So we're not, and I don't have the slide here. We asked the students, when you go back, when the pandemic is over, how do you want your classes in person, online? What percentage do you want in person, 20% online? Only 20% said they want all their classes in person. The majority said they wanted about half, like the modal category was, they want half the classes in person, half the classes online. And then there was about 15% they wanted all online forever. So that's what I mean. The lived experiences changed what people want. The students like the flexibility of the online courses where they can do it, the convenience of it. I don't know whether they say they don't want all of it, but they want more of it than they did before the pandemic. And I think teaching behaviors also have changed. You know, I think we all found there are things we liked about this kind of remote instruction. So my conjecture is the world has changed because of our lived experience, but exactly how that is, we don't know.
Right. Thanks. Thanks again for the presentation. So you showed the graph with the peer composition. There's been some research into like peer effects on course selection in the US. And I was just wondering if you did anything to look for, any pandemic effects on the peer effect. So with that, there seems to be some segregation by the UMR students and non-UMR. So just wondering if you looked at, did that peer effect maybe change during the pandemic? The peer exposure would be at least different, less salient.
Yeah, no, I think there are two questions driven from that. One is, did the shape of the peer composition change during the pandemic? And the second one was a question about, were the effects of the peer composition change over time? My guess is the peer composition didn't change because the students still basically took the same kind of courses, but you would expect a weakening of the peer effects because it's mediated by the remote instruction. So I would predict you're not as influenced by your peers when you're not sitting next to them. I would also predict that you're less likely to find a romantic partner. And I published, David might remember this, in RSSM, a study a couple decades ago. In the US, between a quarter and a third of college-educated marriages that both people are college-educated, they came from the same school, the same college. Huge effect on social stratification is that colleges are marriage markets. Maybe not so much with the pandemic, but maybe yes. I don't know what's going on in the what do you call it? The breakout rooms. maybe they need to be chaperoned. Okay. Thanks so much for.
And Richard, thank you so much once more for a great presentation.
Great.
We have a lunch breakout room, but it's physically over here.
Okay.
So I'm sorry to say, but it's lunchtime here in Denmark. And
Good.
Thank you so much for this very great presentation. Yes.
Right. Thanks.